So if you're new to our class, I think it should be said that I am not normally on the teaching rotation. So if you don't enjoy today, be sure and come back and give it another try. But our normal rotation of teachers, they do a great job, and we certainly appreciate them. I am just filling in. We got a pretty good chunk of scripture to cover today, but I'm not planning on really getting off in the weeds too much. But we're going to continue talking about Jacob today. So we've been following Jacob's story the last few weeks in Genesis. We'll be in Genesis 35 today. And so today is going to kind of serve as a close to the saga of Jacob, I guess you could say. So we've been studying him for a few weeks, and today we're going to kind of bring his story to a close. It's not the last time that we'll see him, but the next time we see Jacob after this, he's going to be more of a supporting character in the narrative that we see him in. With that, I want to go back and talk about where we left off last week. Can somebody give us a quick recap of what we talked about last week, or where we left off last week, or both? What we talked about and where we left off.
Well, nobody in that story did anything right.
That's right. We talked about that. Everybody was the bad guy, right?
Last week was the rape and utilization of Dinah, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, the filing.
That's right.
That was a hard one.
Yeah. So last week, if you were not with us, we talked about so Jacob and his family. He's got all of his wives and all of his kids and his servants and everything, and they've settled outside of a place called Shechem, which is in Canaan. A pagan amongst a pagan people, right? And so what happens is his daughter is out by herself. She's taken by one of the prince or whatever, one of the sons of the guy in charge there. He sexually assaults her, and then they try and kind of move in on Jacob's family by saying, like, I'm going to take her as my wife and we'll live peaceably and all this stuff. And what happened was her brothers, Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, they trick the leaders of Shechem. They say, if y'all are willing to get circumcised, then we'll live amongst you and we'll stay here and everything will be fine. And so the men did that, and while they were recovering, Simeon and Levi went into the town and killed them all. Okay? So that's what happened last week. And then if somebody would read Genesis 34, verse 30.
Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household. But they say, should he treat our sister like a prostitute?"
Okay, so Jacob is not happy, right? And not only that, Jacob is now fearful about what might come upon him and his family, right? So they're in this foreign land. They're surrounded by what now would be considered enemies, right? Because they've made everybody angry by the way that they responded and the way that they've reacted. And so now Jacob is fearful for his family, for himself. And so that's where we're going to pick up today. All right, so can I get someone to read? We're going to kind of take this in sections. Let's see. Let's have somebody read 35 verses 1 through... let's do 1 through 7 for now.
God said to to Jacob, "Arise and go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother.
Thank you. All right, so let's dive in here. All right, verse 1. God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there." Okay, so let's talk about Bethel. If somebody would, go ahead and start turning back to Genesis 28, and I'm going to have you read verses 10 through 22. I think it's important, if we're talking about why Jacob's going back to Bethel, we need to stop and take a minute and let's talk through what happened the first time he was there, right? So can somebody read that for us? 28, what did I say, 10 through 22.
Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it.
And God appeared to the sound of sirens.
And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." So early in the morning Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you."
Thanks. Okay, so Jacob's first time at Bethel. Does anybody remember why he came there in the first place?
He was running from Esau.
That's right. Okay, so he's running from Esau. He's stolen his blessing, his birthright, and all that, and now Esau's angry, and so his parents send him away, right, to keep him safe. So he's running to escape Esau's anger. And so he gets to Bethel, he lays down, God shows him this vision in a dream. And so the main point of what I want to talk about with this scene at Bethel is there was something very profound that happened to Jacob while he was there. And that's going to be important as we continue to talk today. So Jacob, his name even means heel grabber, right? He's a trickster. He's always trying to outsmart and outwit to see what he can gain from any situation, right? And so we're going to see that kind of continue on throughout his life. But he's there at Bethel. He lays down to sleep. God shows him this vision, and he tells him, Jacob, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you the land that you're lying on right now, and all of your descendants, and through your offspring, I'm going to bless the whole earth. Right, and so through the course of that, something happens to Jacob. He comes to a point where he recognizes that God is at work, right? Like God, he says, like, surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't even know it. And so that just got me thinking about like how often God is at work in our own lives, and we miss it because we're too focused on, the small stuff. I listened to one pastor this week. He used an illustration. I think it was by C.S. Lewis. But he talks about, like, if you think about a child that's grown up in poverty, right? And this child, like, all he wants to do is play in this mud puddle with his toys, right? That's all he's ever known is, like, I just want to go out in the alley back behind the house and I want to play in this mud puddle. And somehow his parents gather up enough money, they want to take him on a trip to the beach, right? But he doesn't want to go to the beach. He wants to stay and play in the mud puddle. And so the point of that illustration is, like, God had so much in store for Jacob, and we're going to see, like, as we've seen, Jacob has spent, just wasted like 20, 30 years focusing on the small things that he thinks will satisfy him in his life, when all the while God has something much bigger planned for him, right? And so now back to our story. The main point I want to get across right there is that, God spoke to Jacob. Something profound happened to him where he recognized, like, hey, God is doing something here. This is a special place. Okay, so that's the main point of what I want to talk about there at Bethel the first time. So then we get back to our text today. So Jacob is now fearful for himself and for his family. And God, once again, is looking out for him. And he says, hey, get up. It's time to go back to Bethel. So God says, arise, go to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. Okay. So one commentator pointed out, like, there's no like quarreling or like no hedging or anything. Like, Jacob is not reluctant to go. It says that, so Jacob said to his household, like, okay, we're going to go. So the point that this one guy made was that he did this enthusiastically. And so, we've seen Jacob going down this road, like chasing after all these things. And the point, I think, like from reading it, is even though Jacob acknowledged, that God was doing something in his life, he still was reluctant to give himself over to that fully. He still was chasing after all these other things. And so here we see that God is calling him back, right? God is constantly drawing him back to himself. And we get over into verse 3, and I'm sorry, let me back up. So verse 2, he tells his household, he says, put away the foreign gods that are among you and purify yourselves and change your garments. All right, so if you think about all the ways that God has been faithful to Jacob, and then you get to this part where he tells his household, like, let's put away all the idols. To me, that begs the question, what in the world happened, right? Like, so I made a list. I'm going to get you guys to help me out. Let's name all the ways, not all the ways. Let's name the major ways that we've seen God's faithfulness in Jacob's life up to this point. Cool, I'll start. So he protected Jacob when Esau was trying to kill him, right? What else?
He prospered Jacob in Haran with Laban.
With Laban, that's right. So Jacob goes to stay with Laban. He prospers him. He enriches him. Like, at one point he says, like, when I started out I had nothing. Now I'm 2 camps, right? Like, he has wealth beyond measure, right? What else?
Whenever he was wrestling with God or with that man on his road back to before he got to was that place for Shechem, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
He could have easily, died, and that could have been the end of the story there. But he protected him and broke his hip, and
That's right.
that was
Yeah. What else?
Children.
Yeah, he's given him like lots of children, and not only that, but lots of sons, right? Like, sons were a big deal, and he's given him a lot of them.
Further back, like, he took Esau's blessing, and the Lord, in a way, blessed that.
That's right.
Like, he held up his bargain of like the first blessing and the first son, and how his father, I'm blanking, Isaac, gave him blessing, and so God was like, okay, like that's what's going to happen, and he continued to prosper, bless him through that.
Right. I thought about when he finally flees from Laban. Laban's like coming after him, and God tells Laban, like, don't touch him, don't even speak harshly to him, right? And then, he protects him again when he's going to meet Esau, right? When he finally returns home, he's scared to death. His servant comes back and says, hey, your brother Esau's coming. Oh, by the way, he's got 400 guys with him, right? So, I mean, if it was me, I would be scared. I've stolen all this stuff from my brother. I've really done him wrong. The last time I left, he was trying to kill me, and now I'm returning, and it's him and 400 guys that are probably just going to kill me now, But the point is, like, throughout Jacob's life, God has time and time again shown his steadfastness, shown his love, his faithfulness to Jacob. And somehow, Jacob has still managed to mismanage his house, right? He's allowed them to keep these foreign gods. Now, there's nothing in here that says specifically that Jacob was ever worshiping these idols or anything like that. But, we saw last week where when Simeon and Levi exacted their revenge, like, Jacob didn't really do a whole lot in that. He kind of held back. And so I get this feeling that Jacob is like, that's just kind of the guy that he's been for a long time, right? Like, I'm just going to, things are going pretty well. I'm just going to kind of let things go and not really rock the boat. And as long as everything's going well, like, I'm okay. And so what we see really is Jacob has just kind of gotten comfortable, and he's gotten complacent, and he's let all of these things just kind of drift back into his life or drift into his life. And so the point there is that, even though Jacob, he even says, like, in verse 7, no, I'm sorry. In verse 3, he says, let us arise and go to Bethel so that I may make there an altar to God who answers me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone. So Jacob is not ignorant to this, right? Like, Jacob sees how God has been faithful and that he's brought him up to this point. And so I think a lot of that is applicable to us today. Now, I would venture to guess that nobody in here has, little wooden idols or anything like that. You're not burning incense or like bowing down to these false gods in your home, right? Like, physically, like the act of doing this. But we all have idols in our lives, right? Let's name some.
Money.
Money is a big one, right? And so if we remember, we talked about this a while back, like our idols are anything that they could be a good thing, right? Like, money is certainly a blessing. But when we elevate that to a God-like stature, right? So we take money and we say, if only I had X amount of money, like then I would be content, right? So money's a big one. What else?
Our kids.
That was the first one I thought of. Even more than money, which is, I mean, it would be great to have more money, right? I mean, so what about our kids?
I guess just the fact that our entire worlds revolve around them day and night, 24 hours a day, which is necessary sometimes, but also the mindset that you have about that. I guess whenever we don't leave that necessary room to think about Christ and leave time for prayer and time in the Word and mom and dad relationship, all of those types of things.
Mm-hmm. I think there's an element of like identity in that, right? Like when we have an idolatrous relationship with something, there's an element of like this is part of who I am, right? Like I can't, like without this one thing, like I don't know who I am, or I don't, you know what I'm saying? Like my identity is in crisis if I'm without this one thing that I've placed so much emphasis on. And like kids, I think is a big one when you think about that. What are others?
Like to-do list or productivity, which I think I reflect back on that at the end of the day. Like I don't wake up like thinking, oh, I'm gonna put my to-do list or how much I get done and my like the day went well. But by the end of the day, I'll like think back, you know, oh, I didn't get enough done today, or I didn't get this done, or I didn't reach out to this person when like, and then it just becomes all I think about a lot.
Yeah.
And I mean, I wouldn't think that would be like a little idol, but I see it a lot in Jacob's. Like he had a lot going on. Like he probably didn't intentionally, you know, mean for these little gods to collect. But when you're busy and you're, you know, trying to get things done or trying to whatever, it's just so easy for Satan to use that as a foothold in your life.
Mm-hmm. You're so busy focusing on all these other things that you just let
Right.
things get in. Yeah.
Probably it's not important, but I can very much base my days off of how productive I was based on what I define that as too.
Right.
Not what the Lord defines that as.
Yeah. So here's the thing, guys. It can be anything, right? Anything. Like it could be your spouse. It could be a job, right? Anything that is taking our focus off of Christ, right? Anything that we elevate to that level, like I have to have this to know who I am, or I have to have this to be content or to be happy. You know, we talked about this when we talked back about the Tower of Babel, right? When Adam and Eve were put out of the garden, like that left a gaping hole in them, right? Like that communion with God. And everything else since then, right? Like all the things that we do, whenever we sin, we're trying to put something in the place where God is supposed to be, right? It's all in an effort to get back to that communion, that communion with God. And so the point is that, you know, even though Jacob can look back and say, like, God has been with me through this whole ordeal. He's never left me. You know, even though he can see, like, back at Bethel the first time, like, God is at work. God is moving in me, in my life, in the world around me. Like, idolatry is something that we're going to struggle with on and on and on. Like, one experience with God is not going to fix our struggle with idolatry. Now, he makes it clear, right? Like, we're free from the power of sin, right? Through Jesus, like we're able to fight against that, but it's always going to be a struggle. Like we're not going to be able to look back and say, you know, God saved me on this date, and I've never had the urge to put anything in the place of God since then, right? Because we're still fallen, right? And so, you know, so that's what we see in Jacob. And I think that, kind of to Jordan's point, like, I think that Jacob just kind of let things go, right? Like he just, like life just kind of happened, right? And I think that that's something that I'm very guilty of, is just, allowing life to go on. And like, how often do I really stop and think back to like what God has done for me and in my life? And so really that's what we see God doing here. Like Jacob has run and run and run, God has proven himself over and over again, and Jacob still is just kind of doing his own thing. And so here what we see is God is continually drawing him back to himself, right? And so the further that Jacob has gotten away from that first experience at Bethel, the easier it is for him to forget just what God has done, and like that powerful feeling that he felt while he was there, right? And the same is true for us. If you're a believer, at some point in your life, like God did a work in you that was so profound, he brought you to the brink where you say, you know what, like I can't do it on my own. Like I have no hope in myself, right? If you're a believer, like at some point in your life that happened. But the further we get away from that moment, if we're not careful, if we're not, staying in the Word and like spending time in prayer, the further we get away from that moment, the easier it is for us to forget just what God's done. So I think that's kind of the picture that we see here with Jacob. And so, let's see, continuing on. Verse 6, so it says that Jacob built an altar. So if you go back to the first time that he was at Bethel, right? He said, surely God is in this place. And so he constructs a pillar. And I tried my best to really get a good idea of like what the difference is. The best I could come up with is that a pillar was just like a marker, right? Like to just kind of denote like, hey, this is like something happened here, like, as a reminder kind of. But the difference is like an altar has this sense of like communion with God, right? Like it's a worshipful act. And so, maybe that kind of speaks to Jacob's immaturity the first time that he was there. And now he comes back and he's able to look back over his life and really like take stock and see like what God has done. One pastor likened it to like the wake behind a boat. So like, you're any boatmen in here? Fishermen? Yeah? Okay. One. Don't ask anybody in here to go fishing, all right? Okay, fisher women also, I'm sorry. Lori, I apologize. But so if when a boat is going through the water, you look back and like you see the water like churned up and everything. So what this one pastor said is like God wants for us to be able to look back over our life and see what he calls a wake of restoration and healing, right? And so I think that that's kind of what Jacob's doing here. He's looking back over his life and he's saying, you know what, like God has been with me. God has restored me over and over again. God has healed me. He's healed relationships that I've had that have been broken on my account. And so, for a long time, Jacob was running away from that. And finally, he answers God's call and he says, go back here. And so this is kind of Jacob remembering what God has done, right? Like coming back to that moment when God made those promises to him.
And it's really interesting because as he said, and as the Lord said, that he's been with him all this time. So the Lord could have spoken to him and told him these things anywhere, right? But he asked him to come back to that special place, kind of like what you were saying at the very beginning, and how for all of us, like, we can be like Jacob, right? We can have those type of things that fill up our space, but something about a proximity, whether it's a place or a relationship or a person or a moment, like if I can just get back to that, like the Lord could use that and speak, like having, maybe it was 5 years ago, you had a really great, powerful moment of either redemption or restoration or joy and celebration, and somehow you want to like get back to that. I think there is power in either going back to that place or picking up the phone and calling that friend, or sitting down with someone who experienced it with you and being like, remember when you did that? Remember when you showed up for us? And how we can literally take that and yeah, like what he's saying, you can use that here and now. And that's not to say that there's like magic or anything in that moment, but that the Lord, there's ties. There's these like spiritual, beautiful ties in different people and places and experiences that we have. And like, God's like, yeah, like go, you can remember who I am and who we were together in that time there. And you can use that strength and encouragement to go forward and do all the rest of the things I have for you. It's really powerful.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Especially the part about like the people,
Yeah.
right? Like, getting encouragement from like people that walk through that with you. That's a really good point. Yeah.
Piggyback on that. So, like, Laura's exactly right. Like, and this place has kind of been interesting to me in weeks where I've taught, where Bethel's kind of a recurring theme. So Abram, in chapter 12, verse 8, from there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And then, like, he builds lots of other altars, Mamre. And then in 13, and he journeyed on from the Negev, 13:3, journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been in the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. Like, so I do think, for whatever reason, that this is a special place. Like, this is a holy place. Like, and Jacob in 28 says there's a gate to heaven. When I was teaching, I was like, are there really like gateways to heaven? But, a different thought. But like, I do think we need to see significance in the things around us, whether that's a physical place, person. Like, that's a recurring theme in Abraham's story and his family's story, is them coming back to these places and worshiping God.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? All right. So Jacob sets up the altar. Then we get to verse 8. It says, and Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So he called its name Alam-Bakuth, which just means oak of weeping. But I don't really know why Deborah's mentioned here, other than it's interesting because, like, this is Rebekah's nurse, right? Like, she's Rebekah's servant. And so what in the world is she doing there with Jacob and his family? Because he hasn't seen his parents in 30 years, right? And so the footnote in my Bible suggested that maybe it was part of like Rebekah's promise to him. When your brother's anger subsides, we'll send for you. And so maybe, we don't really know, maybe that's why Deborah was there. I don't really know. I don't really know what the significance is of Deborah being here in the middle of this, but that's a possible explanation. Verse 9. Actually, let me get somebody to read verses 9 through 15.
God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob, no longer shall your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel. Hold on, I've lost my spot. Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel, and God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him, and Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. he poured out a drink offering and on it and poured the oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel.
All right, so here we see, so we've kind of seen this before, right? I think Alden talked about it a second ago. When Jacob was first coming back into Canaan, and the night before he's going to meet Esau, and he wrestles with, whether it's like a pre-incarnate Jesus or an angel or whoever it was, an agent of the Almighty, right? And so we've seen this blessing before, and also the language here is similar to that of like when God first gave the promise to Abraham, right? I'm going to make you into a nation of, your nation will be like the sand, right? And so we see that. At first glance, I wasn't really sure, and I'm still not really sure, like why we go through this whole thing again, right? Because we've already seen God bless Jacob and change his name, right? Like we've already seen that take place, and so, but this is like, I think like 10 years later or something, So Jacob wrestles through the night with God. God changes his name and he says, you're not going to be called Jacob anymore, but you're going to be called Israel. And then, like, Jacob meets with Esau. God protects him. They reconcile with each other. And then Jacob goes and lives among these pagans in Shechem, and, the wheels fall off again, right? And so I can't help but think that maybe this is... like maybe like we're going through this again because like now Jacob has reached a point in his life where, he's finally, again, we talk about God constantly drawing him back to himself, right? And so maybe Jacob has gotten to a point now where God says, I want you to come back to this place. And, he confirms the blessing from previous, and he reminds Jacob, like, I changed your name for a reason. Like, I don't want you to go back and live the way that you've been living your whole life. Like, I have something better in store for you. And again, the language here is similar to that in Genesis 17 when God speaks to Abraham. Again, in 28 when Isaac speaks to Jacob and blesses him as he's leaving. But one difference to note is that in 28 verse 3, Isaac says, God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples. And over here in 35, God says, a nation and a company of nations shall come from you. So, like, again, we're so tempted to think small scale, but God is saying, like, you're not just going to be like a company of peoples. Like, I'm going to make nations and nations and nations out of you. Kings are going to come from your descendants. And so this is also kind of symbolically like passing the torch, right? So, God gave the promise to Abraham. He gave it to Isaac, and now that is being passed on to Jacob, right? So he is the heir of this promise that was first given to Abraham. And so that's kind of what we see here. Let's see, verses 14 and 15. It says, and Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. Y'all, I don't know. The drink offering thing, I tried to figure that out. I know like in Leviticus and Numbers, there's a drink offering associated with burnt offerings, and there's food offerings and all this stuff. Of course, this predates that, right? And so I don't know. Other than like, as with that being part of, part of the ceremonial law and, the burnt offerings and everything, I can only assume that this is some type of, like it's an act of worship, right? And oil is, like pouring out of oil is, like there's an element there of like God's Spirit, right? Like, I don't know. I'll be honest with you, I don't know. So I don't really want to speak too much on it. Anybody in here an expert on drink offerings and oil?
I mean, the Amplified version says the oil was to declare it sacred for God's purpose.
Okay.
So obviously the oil was used as like which is interesting. I don't know about wine.
Right.
This in parentheses says drink offering of wine. So.
Yeah, that's right. It was like a hin of wine or something like that in Numbers or whatever. Anyway, the point here is that Jacob has come back to Bethel, and he has a posture of worshipfulness, right? And I think that's the main idea here, without getting into the weeds about the drink offering and the oil and all that. All right, so moving right along. Okay, we're going to probably rush through this next part pretty quick. So verses 16 through 20, we see that Rachel gives birth to Benjamin, and she dies in childbirth. She names him Benoni, which has kind of an ambiguous meaning. It can mean son of my sorrow or son of my strength, but Jacob changes it to Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. And so some commentators point out that this is, if you think back, like throughout Scripture, there's like types, right? Like types of Christ. So like Adam is a type of Christ, right? Like a Christ figure. So anyway, some commentators point out that Benjamin here could be like a type of Christ, right? Like, son of my sorrow, son of my strength, but ultimately like triumphant, right? As the son of my right hand. So verse 21, he's still, if you look at this on a map, so Jacob has come from the east, and he's come back into Canaan like this, and then he's kind of making his way south. So he's continuing to make his way south to Hebron, which is where his father Isaac is. And in verse 22, we see that his oldest son, Reuben, went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. So we don't really know why Reuben chose to do this. Maybe he was trying to challenge Jacob as like the head of the household or something, or it could have just been, a sinful act of lust. We don't really know what his reasoning was, or really why it's included. But it says that Jacob heard of it, or Israel heard of it. But it doesn't say that he really does anything about it. But, because this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where he just kind of stood back and just kind of let life just kind of wash over him, right? But we do learn later that he takes away Reuben's birthright as the firstborn. Like, so Reuben will not inherit the firstborn portion of the estate.
Pretty big deal.
Yeah, it is a really big deal.
Big deal.
Yeah. But I would say like also what Reuben did was a big deal, right?
But even like thinking about Christ and like his lineage, like what would have happened?
Right.
Like crazy. It's crazy to think about.
Okay, real quick. So in verse 23, we see a list of all of Jacob's sons. these were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. Technically, Benjamin was not born there, but this is really just like a summary statement of all the sons that were born to Jacob. So then finally, real quickly, we see in 27 through 29, Jacob finally makes it back home, right? And like, again, back at Bethel, he said, if God brings me back to my father's house in peace, I will serve him, right? And so God is faithful to do that, even though, I don't want to condone like putting conditions on God, right? Like it for sure is sinful for me to say, God, if you will do this for me, then I will serve you, right? But aside from that, God does remain faithful to Jacob throughout all of his wanderings and all of his wrong turns throughout his life, and he finally brings him back to his father's house. 30 years later, and it says that Isaac was 180 years old. So he was 150 when Jacob left. And, when Jacob left, he probably didn't think he was ever going to see his dad again, But that's just, to me, that was just one more example of like God's faithfulness. Not even God's faithfulness, but just like His graciousness, right? Like giving us those things that we don't deserve. For all the bad that Jacob's done in his life, like, he couldn't complain if he came back 30 years later and his mom and dad were both dead, right? Like there's no complaining there for Jacob because it's all his own actions that have led to that. But anyway, here we see he comes back home. He's able to see Isaac. It says Isaac breathed his last and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And his sons, Esau and Jacob, buried him. So that kind of, to me, that just like brings the whole thing full circle, right? From the outset, we see that Jacob is just, he's a liar, he's a cheat. And then he ruptures his family when he steals the blessing from Esau, and then that just kind of launches him on this path. And he literally makes like a big circle, right? Like he's exiled to a faraway place, and then he slowly makes his way back. He's reconciled to his brother. He sees his dad again, and then the two brothers together are able to bury their dad, unified. And so to me, that's just a really beautiful picture of what God is capable of doing, even in the midst of our struggle, right? Like not only is that what God's capable of doing, like if we allow ourselves to be a part of it, but even when we don't allow ourselves to be part of it, like God is working and moving, and He's able to do some incredible things, even in the face of our own sinfulness. So that kind of closes the book on Jacob. Next week we'll start talking about Joseph, and I think we'll be there for a few weeks. Are there any closing thoughts? We're like right at 11:30. So, are there any closing thoughts? Anybody want to share?
Did we talk about Rachel dying?
I kind of rushed through it. I got bogged down at the first part, so that.
I think my study Bible says something about like when she gave birth to Joseph, was it Joseph? And his like it was whoever the first one that she gave birth to was.
Joseph
Yeah,
was
and her
first.
name, she was like, give me another son. And she gets another son, and then she dies. So like, I think my study Bible says something about her not being content. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's a lot out there about Rachel, stuff that I've never really thought about, but like, she was the one that stole the idols from her father's house when they fled from Laban, and so there's nothing in there specifically that says like Rachel was a pagan or an unbeliever or whatever, but there is like room to kind of wonder, like how much of a helpmate was she through all of this with Jacob. It's very interesting.
Yeah, she's kind of a sad character.
Any other thoughts? All right, let's pray. God, thank you so much for this class, for this passage, God, for the story of Jacob that we've been studying the last few weeks. God, just the way that you worked in his life. God, even when he forgot about you completely at times, which, God, if I'm honest, I'm very prone to do. But God, I'm grateful that just like in Jacob's life, in my own life, God, that you are constantly drawing me back to yourself. And God, we know from Scripture that you will never cease to do that. So we can praise you for that, and we can be thankful for that today. Watch over us as we go out from here, God. We love you. Thank you again for this time together. It's in your name we pray. Amen.